Grids are perhaps one of the most important things when it comes to layout for screen design, but it might not be exactly what you think. It's not some rigid, immovable grid that can never change because, as we all know, screen sizes are different down from mobile phones to laptops to larger screens. So while you are going to design a static grid, it's never going to be completely static when it gets online, or at least it shouldn't be. So you need to think about your grid and also the things that are inside of the grid containers as stretchy, movable objects that have some parameters on them at different sizes. So let's take a look at a few different examples. But it's important to know that grids exist for a reason. They are a source of truth, and they provide the kind of necessary structure that just keeps information and graphics clean and readable and scannable. And once things are lined up and in a grid, it just kind of gives it a nice quality, a nice finished structure. And the grid actually serves as a tool to the greater attribute of just simple alignment. So having things left aligned and having a straight, sharp line and things balanced out, things that are aligned and balanced, they just feel like they invoke trust and it's been thought out. And the grid is a tool to help you achieve that alignment. So the goal is alignment. The goal isn't to use a grid. The goal is to achieve balance and harmony. So let's take a look at a few examples of what I'm talking about. So one of the most common grid sizes for a website is a 12-column grid. So you can see here, if I open my properties panel, you can see I've got a 1440 width website, and I just went to Website MacBook Pro to create that artboard. And it doesn't really matter what size you're designing for, because we are in the responsive web design era and everything should be responsive. So it's not really going to matter the exact size. Back in the day, it used to matter if you're safe to design 800 pixels. And then later on, it was you're safe to design 960. Now you're safe to design 1024. Now you're safe to design 1280. That's not really a thing anymore as much as it used to be, because everyone has embraced responsive design. And we'll get a lot more into responsive stuff later, but for now, I just want to put that out there that this is more of a temporary grid for this particular screen size. So 12 columns is popular because it allows for you to have multiple options. So if this grid here is 12 columns, and to do this in Figma, all I did was click on the artboard name and then just add a grid right here. So I go layout grid, click this thing. I want columns. I want 12 columns. And I just left the gutter at 20. And you can stretch this all the way across, or you can center it. And let's make this a little bit wider. So something like that, that's fine. So the reason this is popular is you can go all the way across. You can easily get some left and right action going on. If you wanted 3 columns wide, it's pretty easy to kind of create this dynamic. And if you wanted 4 columns, you just kind of divide it and make it happen. If you ever want to line things up, it just makes it a little bit easier to get all of this working. So if I go back here and disable that grid for now, I'm going to line these up with 20 just so it looks nice and even. There we go. So there you go. That is the basic usage of a grid. And if you were going to, start putting content inside of this grid, your typeface, you might end up having a really big title that may or may not align to this left edge. So this is where your containers come into play. We might actually decide that we want, 60 pixels of margin or padding rather on the top left and right. And then that might affect the internal padding of this module. It just depends on what the content is. So the grid is just there to give you a starting point. It's not rigid and you have to abide by the grid. It's not all hail the mighty grid. And in fact, in a lot of projects, I don't even start with a 12 column grid or any kind of grid. I prefer more of a content out approach. And it's for this exact reason, because you never know exactly what's going to go inside of these containers. So if I scroll over here and check this out, I've got the same 12 column grid on this just super rough, like kind of blocky wireframe thing as like a incredibly low fidelity kind of a layout. So you got maybe like a logo, some navigation, headline, calls to action. Maybe this is a background color. And then you kind of have this S curve that's going through here with the features and whatnot. It's a pretty standard layout. Well, if you're going to use a grid, that's totally fine. The grid is going to help you out to lay this out, to make sure that this is nice and aligned and the images and the text are nice and aligned. And that doesn't mean that you can't have an image that's larger, that's breaking the grid, because that's also its own form of alignment. It just kind of helps you set those boundaries so you can actually see what's going on. Get our grid back. But like I said, it's only temporary for that size. If you scale this down, you're not going to use a 12 column grid on a mobile layout. In fact, I can't recall a time I've ever used an actual grid or an overlay on a mobile layout, because it doesn't really make that much sense. Most of the time you're going to just scale things down into a 1 column layout, and usually at the very most, I mean, you might have some images that are in a bit of a grid like this, and maybe maybe these swipe across or something like that, but it's still more of a 1 column layout right in here, and you don't really rely on that grid that much. Because once you get into mobile, I like to rely more on my implicit grid that I use, and we'll cover that in another section. But I do mainly just want to point out that 12 column grid is great to get started, and it definitely helps you with aligning up, different options and just kind of keeping things balanced. So I want to show an example of what this looks like in practice. So if you look at this global design survey that Dribbble released for the end of 2019, you can see it's kind of like a nice, big, large image, and they're defining the edge of their grid right in here. So you can imagine there's probably some kind of implicit grid right in here, and they're breaking it with some of these avatars, which is kind of fun. A lot of times you need to break the grid to make things a little bit more visually interesting. And it's highly unlikely that any of these avatars are adhering to a particular grid. They've just kind of placed them in an area that makes sense. So as we scroll down, you can see that this is now indented from the top area. So if I scroll up, you can see there's a big indentation right here. So they could have left align that, but maybe they're shifting over their internal content maybe they wanted this to be a little bit more centered, or they might have just chosen to follow inside of the internal grid. But you can see now one of the things that might have made that decision for them is they have this larger grid across here, and now they want this data up here to align with this vertical line. So they have this kind of line of continuation going. If I leave my cursor right here and you scroll, it's just a really clean and nice way to execute the left edge of a grid. And the same way with this picture right here, I'm sure if we scroll down, we're going to get this text. And you can tell this text is not exactly left edge aligned with that image. And it's not that important that everything is exactly lined up. It might be lined up, but maybe that picture, because it's breaking the grid over here, they've actually indented it from that side. So it just adds a little bit more interest. So there may be a rough grid to keep things going, but it's not necessarily some rigid and immovable thing. And you can see now that these white tiles here are, if I leave my cursor there and scroll all the way up, that might be the left edge of the grid, the actual grid, and maybe the title is indented in 60 pixels or so. So as you scroll through this page, you can kind of get a feel for what the grid might be, but it doesn't necessarily have this like rigid quality to it. So these tiles are lining up with the left edge of that text. Kind of have the same thing going here. They're, you know, it's kind of this slight juxtaposition. So if we pull this screenshot into Sketch, I've just adding a grid in Sketch is a little bit different. You click this little icon here, and if it's not showing, you can go to View, Grid, or Layout. This is actually a layout. The grid is slightly different. And then you can go to Layout Settings and adjust everything in here. And I added an 18 pixel grid or an 18 column grid to this just because I very quickly just wanted to add something that roughly lined up, just so we could look at this in somewhat of a grid format. So I tried to line these up where they were forming a grid and then there was a little bit of a space. That way it just helps to see the vertical lines. So you can see that even on this, it's not necessarily following a very strict grid. It can be a little bit loose. It's just a matter of kind of using it to help you start to line things up. And like I said, the grid serves the ultimate purpose of achieving alignment and balance. So it's not even important that the grid exists if you are achieving balance and alignment with other items or other methods. You might even just use one ruler to align two different objects. So in this next example, this is the Switch to Studio project that I created for InVision. And I'm gonna make these lines a little bit darker so we can see what's going on here. All right, so now that I've got these grid lines showing, I'm going to reload this page in another tab just so you can see the difference between the grid showing, and then I don't know if it's coming through or not, but it is kind of an aesthetic where these grids are showing. A little bit hard to see because I made it intentionally really dark so it wasn't too distracting. But right here, this is a simple 3-column grid, and this is one of the only projects that I can really think of where I really stuck to a grid. And you can see it's just very simple. So this is kind of breaking in like a 2-column grid, but it has like a maximum width on here so it doesn't get too close to this button. And I have this little navigation piece aligned here. And as we go down here, you can see this stuff is right aligned here. The footer has this left aligned. So it just kind of creates this left and right balance between everything. And it also just kind of helps with the layout. So all of these are gonna, fit within that particular grid. So now you can see if I actually test the responsiveness of this web page, you can see once I get to a certain point, this grid is gonna break. So I'm using a media query to change the position and the size of the title for smaller screens. But eventually you can tell this 3-column grid is not going to work out so well. So I have to you have to think about what's going to happen on smaller screens. So now I'm going to a 2-column grid, and you can't see the double lines right here. But also eventually this 2-column grid is going to break. So eventually I go to a 1-column grid. And that's all things that are possible with responsive web design. And even with applications that are larger, you can change from a 12-column grid to a 6-column grid to a 3-column grid. It's not something that is rigid and immovable. Now you can't design at a stretchy size when you're using a design tool because by definition, you're moving things on a fixed canvas, and you can use resizable components and everything, but while you're designing the one component, it is going to be fixed. So you have to kind of adopt this mindset that things are going to be stretchy, and you start to kind of understand that the grid is is helpful, but it's not going to be some kind of omnipresent thing that's always going to be exactly the same on every single screen size. So this is just a good example of seeing something that does adhere strongly to a grid, but it also changes pretty dramatically as the screen size gets larger and smaller. And so if you look at some of these original designs that I did, this was a big document where I'm just trying to get some ideas, and I was actually trying to design this mobile first, and I'm just kind of playing around with some designs. I went in and kind of made these illustrations and decided, okay, each one of these is going to have this kind of setup, some kind of like title, basic introduction, and then, a little graphic. And I decided, okay, let me try to lay this out on a larger screen. And you can see here, I'm not really using a grid right here. I'm just trying to, I do have kind of a maximum width started here because I just wanted to go 3 wide with these. You can see it's like kind of centered. It's 147 over here, 148 over there. But I haven't really yet defined a grid, because what I like to do with grids is kind of let the content dictate what the grid might need to be. So I'm designing some of this content first, and then as I am kind of working through this, I'm like, okay, I probably need to start applying a little bit more structure to this. So I started a new document here, and then in this one, this is where I started with this screen here, and I was like, okay, what if I use this 3-column grid, and then I kind of like the idea of this being techie. I wanted it to fit the kind of studio aesthetic. So I'm using this typeface from Clem Type Foundry. I think this is called Trim or Micro. I can't remember. Yeah, Micro. And it has these kind of like hard edges cut onto the characters. And so I thought it would be cool to use the grid lines and these little techie blinking dots that you can see on the actual site. So this thing kind of blinks as you go across, some fun little like hover effects. And then even if you go into this, you can see I'm not using the full 3-pixel grid or 3-column grid. I'm using kind of like a big kind of 2 columns and then like 1. So it's kind of the spirit of the 3-column grid is there, but it's changed a little bit for the internal page. So back in this design file, this is kind of when I decided, okay, I'm going to use this 3-column grid, and it's based on the fact that I have these 5 modules here. And I'm anticipating adding more, so I know that I can kind of pop them in and add them here. But something about this layout just wasn't working for me. I didn't necessarily want to have just a huge title. I wanted it to have a little bit more of a unique feel. So I ended up carrying the same grid over, and I was like, what if I kind of do something where maybe I don't start on the first. Maybe the first module doesn't start until the second, and I can have these kind of juxtaposition of things pushing things over to the left and right. So that's when I started working on these designs, where I brought in just a huge typeface. I'm using like 110 point size here for this larger title. And then I wanted watching the trailer to be the kind of main call to action. And then as you scroll down, then you get these big tiles. And so you can see I'm kind of mimicking the kind of cut off title here with some of these other titles. And these aren't necessarily these internal containers, they are not really based on a grid. I'm using this 3-column grid to serve as like a general baseline. But once I get down into the actual content and the actual containers, I'm just kind of doing what I want to do. But I'm still going to make sure that this title is left aligned with this here, and I have like the strong alignment quality. So you can see all of this is 38 from the edge. Usually I would do like 40. That might have gotten bumped over. So this might be 40 from the top, 40 from the 40 from the top, and 40 from the left. And then I get in here, I'm using more of an implicit grid here, which I'll cover more in detail. But just to say that the grid is a starting point. It just kind of helps you frame out the content that you're designing. And the grid is also a lot more common in bigger websites, like larger larger screen size websites, like laptop size, desktop size, on those larger screens, that's when you'll get into more of the 3-column, 4-column, 6-column, 1-column, you know, a lot of those, like the ideas of the columns. But once you get down into mobile, like you saw on the mobile version of that Switch to Studio, things are going to get more into a 1-column grid. Not even a grid, it's going to be 1 column. And then you're going to be a lot more reliant on your spacing system and your spacing structure, which is more of the implicit grid. So if you look at this app that I designed back in Framer here, you know, I'm not using any grid at all. There's no layout grid. I'm relying on the idea of spacing rules. So I've got this 16 pixels from the left, 20 pixels from the top, 20 pixels from there. And this is 16 from here, you know, and then I've got, these are 6 pixels apart. I think that actually got moved a little bit. These are supposed to be 0. But the idea on the smaller screens is that most things are in a 1-column grid. And technically, I mean, you could call this a, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4-column grid, but it's just, in my experience, it's not that helpful to try to grid out every little detail. You know, grid the bigger, kind of larger structure if that's helpful for you. But then once you get down into the weeds of especially on mobile screens, I'm going to rely much more on an implicit grid structure than an overall bigger, larger grid structure. Now, I'm going to cover implicit grid in a lot more detail in another lesson, but for this lesson, just grids and containers in general, some of the key takeaways are going to be: grids are important. You should use them, but you shouldn't rely on them as the rigid, immovable law that all things must snap to. It's just a guide and a starting point. So don't expect your grid to do all of the designing for you. It's just not going to work. It's going to help you align things, which is a great start, but then you're going to have to get into the containers and the modules inside of that grid to make things work as well. And so you need to start thinking about your implicit padding and margins that you're going to use across all of your elements, whether it expands out of the grid or it adheres to a very systematic approach. That's up to you, but the grid is not going to design for you. It's just going to be a good starting point. It's also important to remember that grids are going to be stretchy. You know, they're gonna expand and collapse based on screen size. You can have fixed sidebars and fixed elements that don't get smaller with the rest of the content. Some of it can remain fixed, but that's going to be based on the content. So basing it out on like a content out approach, maybe your left navigation is going to be a fixed width while your right side is going to be stretchy. But then once it gets down into the smaller view, something's got to happen with that right nav. Maybe it goes into a little hamburger menu. Maybe it changes into, you know, its own stretchy container above the content, but something's got to happen once you get down to mobile. That's why I often design mobile first with applications and sometimes with marketing sites, but a lot of times marketing sites have a lot more flair going on. So sometimes I'll start larger with those just to get some ideas going. I'm going to provide this sketch file as kind of a starting point. You don't have to use Sketch. You could use Figma, but I have this file and I wanted to show you how some of this is set up here. I've got this one symbol here called line item, 2-line with image and icon. So if I look at the symbol here, you can see I've got this avatar image, I've got a name, description, and then a little icon. The icon's not necessary. I just have this as a way to show some component overrides. But inside of Sketch here, what I've done is on this element, if you have an image inside your symbol, you can choose an image and either upload one yourself, or you can use the sketch data here and grab a different face and pop it in. Any of these can be updated with some random faces or random names. You know, and I'm only using one symbol here and I'm just updating it, and I'm hiding or showing these icons based on, you know, what that particular line item might need to be. So for your homework, I want you to come up with one of your favorite TV shows or movies, and I want you to design like 3 to 5 of the characters and get like a cover image and a title and a description of the show or the movie. And maybe you use some kind of casting module and it has like 3 to 5 of the main characters, and you use a setup similar to this. It doesn't have to be the same design, but I want you to design like a small version, a mobile version, and then a larger version. And you can use this file as reference to see what happens possibly between the mobile casting version, and then maybe on your larger version, you do have a 12 column grid that is showing. I'm going to hide this, Control G, actually Control L will move the layout. And so maybe you have, your once 100% stretchy casting module is now a fixed, let's see, how wide is that? 380 pixels based off of this layout. And maybe you have a big title over here for the name of the show, or, maybe you move these down here. It's up to you. Maybe you have a big image, you have a title, but use the grid here to kind of help you get an idea of how this stuff is going to be laid out. Just going to go bold on both of these. I'm not going to design too much of this. I just kind of want to give a quick idea of some things that could possibly work. Maybe this is the cast. So use the grid, try to get an idea. Maybe the description is here and this ends up being, something else. It's not that important that you get everything ever written about the show, but maybe you use Wikipedia or IMDb or something like that to figure it out. And, decide based on your grid, do you want this block of copy to extend all the way over here, or would it actually be a little bit better to keep this a little tighter? You use this grid and kind of feel out what feels balanced and what is aligned, and then take the same exact thing and put it on your mobile screen that you would have over here. So you might have your cast is actually moved down, and you try to figure out how to change this information from a larger desktop screen down into a smaller screen. And you're going to have to change the title size. You're going to have to adjust a few sizes and widths of images, but you will get an idea of how you can transition between a single column grid and start needing to rely on the implicit spacing, and how that will kind of transform and grow into a larger explicit grid where you're explicitly saying 12 columns, 3 columns, 4 columns, something like that. And it's okay to not be 100% sure of what's possible or what should happen in regards to transitioning between the mobile screen and the larger screen. I'm not expecting you to develop this or to know all the CSS rules, but I just want you to kind of get used to the grid and focus on the containers and start using them as reference, and kind of use that as a starting point. So if you have any questions about the grid, about using the grids or the containers, post them in Slack, get some discussion going around it. But get started on the homework and post your work, and we'll take it from there.